The word landed in the middle of the dusty yard like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through Pearl Turner's chest were the kind that threatened to crack something she had spent 3 years keeping carefully sealed. "A better offer," she repeated, and her voice came out lower than she intended, stripped of the careful pleasantness she had rehearsed on the 4-mile walk from Caldwell to this ranch. Her boots were cracked at the left heel. Her dress, once a decent shade of blue, had been washed so many times it had faded to the color of a winter sky just before dark. She had walked through the gates of the Norris Ranch with a letter of introduction in her hand and hunger riding behind her eyes, and this man, this broad-shouldered, sun-darkened man with a jaw like a fence post and eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy day, was looking at her like she was something he needed to think very carefully about. "That is what I said," Orville Norris confirmed. He had not moved from where he stood on the top step of his porch, and from that height he had an unfair advantage, which Pearl suspected he was entirely aware of. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, a habit she did not yet know was the one tell that gave away when he was genuinely uncertain about something. "I have a better offer for you, Miss Turner, if you will hear me out." Pearl Turner had not come to the Norris Ranch expecting a trap. But then she had not expected most of the things that had happened to her in the past 3 years, and she had learned, at considerable personal cost, that the things you did not expect were exactly the ones that destroyed you. She looked at the man on the porch. She looked at the letter still in her hand, the one written by Mrs. Adelaide Pierce of the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, which said that Pearl Turner was a woman of good character seeking honest employment, experienced in cooking, cleaning, mending, and general household management. She looked at the ranch sprawling behind him, the barn that needed a coat of paint, the fence line that had 3 broken posts visible from where she stood, the vegetable garden on the east side of the house that had potential but was clearly suffering from neglect. She was 24 years old. She had 17 cents in her coat pocket. She had not eaten since the previous morning when Mrs. Adelaide Pierce had given her a biscuit and a sympathetic look that Pearl had found considerably more insulting than any outright dismissal would have been. "Hear me out," she said carefully, "and if I do not like what I hear, then you walk back down that road," Orville said, "and I wish you well, and you keep the letter." Something about that answer surprised her enough that the careful armor she wore shifted slightly. She looked at him again, more closely this time, because a man who offered you an exit before he even made his proposal was either the most honest man she had ever met or the most dangerous one. "Talk," she said, and that was how everything began. 3 years and 4 months earlier, Pearl Turner had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, on the Santa Fe Railway with a husband, a hope chest, and a plan. The husband was named Roy Turner, and the plan had been his. Pearl had been 20 years old and freshly married and willing to follow a man she loved into a new territory, because that is what women did in 1882, and Pearl had not yet developed the particular skepticism that comes from watching love curdle into something unrecognizable. Roy Turner had been handsome in the way that trouble is sometimes handsome, all easy smiles and forward momentum, and an inability to sit still that Pearl had mistaken for ambition. He had talked about Kansas the way preachers talked about heaven, as if the simple act of getting there would solve everything. There was land, he said. There was opportunity. A man could build something real in Kansas, something lasting, something that would be theirs. What Roy Turner had not mentioned in the 2 years of courtship in Ohio and the 8 months of marriage before they climbed onto that train was that he had a habit. The habit had a name, and its name was cards. Not the casual card-playing of men who had an evening to spare, but the deep and devoted kind, the kind that started as entertainment and ended as religion, the kind that devoured money and land and promises with the patient thoroughness of rust on iron. Pearl had discovered the full shape of the habit 6 months after arriving in Caldwell, when Roy came home from a night in town with the look of a man who had recently been excavated of everything valuable. He had lost the money they'd saved. He had borrowed against their furniture. He had, with the particular genius of a man who was very good at one thing, and that one thing was making catastrophic decisions, promised their lease on the small house they rented to a man named Decker in exchange for the opportunity to win it back on the turn of a card. The card had not turned in his favor. They had been out of the house within a week. Pearl had moved in with the only woman in Caldwell willing to take in a couple whose finances had collapsed as publicly and thoroughly as theirs had, which was Mrs. Adelaide Pierce, widow, chairwoman of the Ladies' Aid Society, and the kind of woman who gave charity with one hand and a list of your failures with the other. Roy had moved into the back room of a saloon called the Prairie Dog, which was, as far as Pearl was concerned, a perfectly fitting destination for him. The marriage had continued in a technical sense for another year, meaning Roy had continued to exist and Pearl had continued to know about it, but in every practical sense it had ended the night he signed away their home. Pearl had been careful during that year. She had taken in mending. She had helped Mrs. Pierce with her housekeeping in exchange for room and board. She had saved every spare cent and tried to figure out what a woman did when the plan she had followed across half the country turned out to be someone else's plan, built on someone else's wishes, and constructed entirely without her input. Roy Turner had died 14 months after the card game, in the spring of 1883, from a fever that swept through Caldwell with the thoroughness of a prairie fire. Pearl had not been beside him when he went, because by then they had not spoken in 6 months, but she had stood at the graveside in the cold April wind and felt something she could not cleanly name. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly. Something that lived in the narrow and uncomfortable space between the two. After that she was a widow, which in 1883 Kansas was not meaningfully better than being a married woman with a missing husband, but it did clarify certain things. It meant the marriage was definitively over, which Pearl found she needed it to be before she could begin thinking clearly about what came next. What came next was the problem of money, which in the spring of 1883 Caldwell was not easily solved for a woman without family connections, without land, and without the kind of useful skills that people paid real money for. Pearl could cook. She could clean. She could mend and sew and manage a household with the competence of a woman who had learned early that if you did not do things yourself, they did not get done. But the jobs available to women of her situation in Caldwell were limited, and they were increasingly filled by women younger and newer to town than Pearl. Mrs. Pierce had tried, in her particular way. She had written letters of introduction to 3 households in Caldwell and 2 in the surrounding countryside, speaking warmly of Pearl's character and abilities, while managing to imply, in the careful architecture of her sentences, that Pearl was a woman who had experienced difficulty and was perhaps slightly worn by it. The first 2 households had declined. The third, a family named Hollies, had hired Pearl for 2 months as a kitchen helper before Mrs. Hollies had her sister come from Missouri to fill the position permanently. The 4th letter had gone unanswered. The 5th letter had been to Orville Norris of the Norris Ranch, 4 miles south of town, and Orville Norris had sent a reply that said, simply, that he was willing to discuss the position if the applicant would present herself on the morning of September 12, 1883. Pearl had presented herself, and Orville Norris had said he had a better offer. Housekeeper left in July, Orville said, still standing on the porch step, still turning the brim of his hat. Married a man from Dodge City and went west. Before her I had my mother managing the house, but she passed in the spring of 1882, and I have been managing as best I can since, which is to say not well. Pearl looked at the porch. There was a dried mud trail leading from the door to the steps that suggested someone had walked through in wet boots and nobody had cleaned up after them. There was a cracked window on the east side of the porch. There was a wooden chair that had lost one of its back rungs and been placed against the wall in a way that suggested the owner intended to fix it and had not yet gotten around to it. "What is the position you are advertising?" she asked, because she had learned that in negotiations, which this clearly was, it was important to make the other person state their terms first. "Housekeeper," Orville said. "As Mrs. Pierce described, room, board, and fair wages. $12 a month." $12 a month was $2 more than the Hollies family had paid her, and considerably more than she was currently making, which was nothing. Pearl's face remained carefully neutral. "The better offer?" she asked. Orville was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hat in his hands. He looked out at the yard, at the fence line, at the barn with its faded paint. Then he looked back at Pearl, and what was in his expression was something she would think about later in the long quiet of sleepless nights, because it was something she had not expected at all. It was honesty. "I have a ranch," he said. "That is too big for one man to run well and too small to justify hiring a full crew. I have 30 acres of cropland I am only cultivating 18 of because I cannot manage more on my own. I have 40 head of cattle that should be 60. I have a house that needs a woman who understands how to run one, not just clean it. I am 30 years old and I have been running this place alone for going on 2 years and I am losing ground." He paused. "What I need," Orville said carefully, "is not just a housekeeper. What I need is a partner, someone who has a stake in how this place runs, someone who is here not because she needs a job but because she needs a home." The word home hit Pearl somewhere behind the sternum. "You are describing a wife," she said flatly. "I am describing a partnership," Orville said, "which can become a marriage if both parties find over time that they wish it to. I'm not asking you to marry me today, Miss Turner. I'm asking you to consider whether you would be willing to work this ranch with me as an equal and whether in time, if things go well, we might consider something more permanent." Pearl stared at him. "You do not know me." "I know Mrs. Pierce's letter," he said, "and I know that you walked 4 miles on a cracked boot heel in September heat and you are still standing straight. That tells me something." Pearl looked down involuntarily. He had noticed the heel. Of course he had. "And if I take the housekeeper position as written," she said, "the $12 a month, the room and board, the ordinary arrangement, what then?" "Then I will be grateful," Orville said simply, "and the offer I just made will remain unmade and we will proceed exactly as employer and employee with every proper boundary that implies." He meant it. That was the unsettling thing. He was not being clever or manipulative. He was laying his cards on the table face up, which was so unlike every other negotiation Pearl had experienced in her adult life that she did not quite know how to respond to it. "I need to think," she said. "Take your time," Orville said. "There is water in the pump around the side of the house if you want it, and I believe there is cornbread in the kitchen from this morning." The mention of cornbread was not calculated. Pearl could tell because he said it the same way he said everything else, without inflection or particular emphasis, just information. But her stomach responded to it independently of her pride, and she was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired of being proud in ways that did not actually help anything. "I will take some water," she said, "and I will think." She went around the side of the house to the pump. The water was cold and clear, and she drank from her cupped hands and then stood for a while looking at the property. The vegetable garden was close to her, and she studied it with the eye of a woman who knew gardens. There were tomato plants that had gone too long without staking, leaning sideways under the weight of fruit that was beginning to rot where it touched the ground. There were onion beds that needed thinning. There were cucumber vines that had gotten ahead of themselves and were spreading across the path. All of it was productive ground that was being squandered not through malice, but through simple, insufficient attention. She walked around the full perimeter of the house. The house itself was solidly built, which told her the man who had built it had known what he was doing. The logs were tight, the foundation was stone, the roof had no obvious sag. The interior, which she could see partly through the open kitchen window, was clean in the way that a person's desk might be clean when they have shoved everything into a drawer, functional but without care. She looked at the barn. She looked at the fields, the dry September gold of them, and the long flat line of the horizon that Kansas gave you in every direction, that particular brutal openness that some people never made peace with, and some people eventually came to need like breath. She thought about the hidden motives she should be suspicious of. She thought about what the trap might look like. A man alone on a ranch, offering a strange arrangement to a woman he did not know, a woman who was effectively destitute and without options. Those were conditions that were ripe for exploitation. She knew what the world contained, but she also thought about the way he had offered her an exit before he had made his proposal. She thought about the cracked window and the broken chair and the overripe tomatoes, none of which were the details a man constructed if he was building a performance designed to deceive. She thought about the fact that he had mentioned the cornbread without trying to use it, and that he had noticed her boot heel without making her feel ashamed of it. Pearl Turner had spent 3 years reading people. She had read Roy Turner wrong, badly wrong, with catastrophic consequences. That experience had not made her a fool. It had made her careful in the deep, bone-level way that actual experience produces, which was different from the surface caution of someone who had only heard about danger secondhand. She read Orville Norris. She went back around the house to the porch. He was sitting in the chair with the missing rung, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that impatience was a waste of resources. He looked up when he heard her boots on the path. "I want $12 a month," Pearl said, "for the first 3 months, in addition to room and board as specified. At the end of 3 months we will reassess." Orville looked at her for a moment. "The position I described as better with the equal partnership." "Yes," Pearl said. "With the understanding that partnership of the kind you described requires trust that neither of us has yet earned from the other, and 3 months is a reasonable period in which to determine whether that trust is achievable." Orville stood up. He was taller than she had registered, which was another unfair advantage, but it was the kind of advantage that a person was born with and could not be held accountable for. He held out his hand. Pearl shook it. His hand was rough from work and warm, and the handshake was firm without being performative, which was exactly what she would have asked for if someone had asked her to specify. "Welcome to the Norris Ranch, Miss Turner," he said. "Mrs. Turner," she corrected, because widows in 1883 used the married title and she had learned the hard way that distinctions mattered. "But Pearl is acceptable if you prefer." "Pearl," he said, as if he was making a note of it. "I am Orville." "Most people call me Orv." "Orville," she said, and he did not argue, just accepted it with a faint shift of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The first 2 weeks on the Norris Ranch were the most purely functional of Pearl's life, which she found she was grateful for. There was an enormous amount of work to do, and it had the mercy of being concrete. The garden needed attention immediately before the remaining harvest was lost. The kitchen needed reorganizing from the bottom up. The pantry needed an inventory and a restocking order. The house needed a thorough cleaning that went beyond what Orville had been managing, which was surface maintenance without depth. Pearl worked from dawn to after dark, not because she felt she had to prove herself, but because there was genuinely that much to do. She attacked the garden first, spending 3 full days staking, pruning, harvesting, and preserving. She put up 14 jars of tomatoes and 6 of cucumber pickles and 3 of dried onion, and lined them up in the pantry with the satisfaction of someone who had created something out of impending waste. Orville watched her work without commenting or intervening, which she appreciated. He was out on the ranch land most of the day, managing the cattle and the crops, and in the evenings he came in with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had been using his body hard all day. He ate whatever she cooked without complaint and with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. He cleaned up after himself. He was not loud. On the 5th evening he came in to find she had repaired the rung on the porch chair, using a piece of wood she had found in the barn, and a technique she had learned from watching a carpenter in Ohio when she was 12 years old. He looked at the chair for a moment, then sat in it with the deliberateness of someone testing something, and nodded. "Thank you," he said. "It bothered me to look at it," Pearl said, which was true. He smiled at that, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face considerably. He had a good smile when he deployed it, one of those transforming ones that rearranged all the lines of a person's features into something unexpectedly warm. Pearl filed it away in the part of her mind that kept notes and did not allow herself to respond to it. By the end of the first week, she had discovered 3 things about Orville Norris that he had not told her, and that she found herself thinking about more than she had anticipated. The first was that he read. There was a shelf in the small room off the parlor, the room he used as a kind of office, and it held 23 books, which in rural Kansas in 1883 represented a significant personal investment. The books were varied. There was a worn Bible that had his mother's name in the front, Edna Norris, written in neat script with a date in 1865. There was a copy of Tennyson. There were 2 history books, one on the Mexican-American War and one on the Transcontinental Railroad. There were 3 agricultural texts, which made practical sense. There was a novel by Dickens and one by Wilkie Collins. And there was, somewhat surprisingly, a small book of poetry by a woman Pearl did not recognize, with a hand-colored illustration on the cover. The second thing she discovered was that he had been teaching himself to play the fiddle, or at least attempting to. She found this out on the 8th night when she heard, from her room on the east side of the house, a sound that could charitably be described as music in an early developmental stage. It was patient music, repetitive in the way that learning something by practice is repetitive, working through the same short passage again and again with small improvements each time. She lay in the dark and listened to it longer than she intended to. The third thing was the grave. It was in the far corner of the garden, marked with a simple wooden cross that was newer than the cross suggested, because the wood had not yet weathered fully. The name carved into it was Clara Norris, 1856–1880. The dates told Pearl that Orville had been married and had lost his wife young, which explained some things about the man on the porch who offered partnerships and exits in the same breath, who ran a household with the determined competence of someone who knew what was missing, but did not know how to stop working without it. She did not ask him about Clara directly. She waited, because she had learned that information offered in time was more honest than information demanded too soon. He told her about Clara on the 14th day, a Sunday evening in late September when the light came through the kitchen window at a long golden angle, and they were both at the kitchen table, Pearl mending a shirt she had found with a torn sleeve and Orville looking at his accounts with the focused unhappiness of a man whose numbers were not cooperating. "You will have seen the grave," he said without preamble. "Yes," Pearl said. "Clara was my wife. She died in the winter of 1880, a difficult pregnancy and then a fever after. The baby did not survive either." He said it with the flatness of someone who had shaped the words so many times they had lost their edges but not their weight. "That was when I lost the first of the crew. Men do not stay on a ranch where the household has fallen apart. By 1882, when my mother passed, I was down to 2 hired hands, and by this spring they had gone for better wages in Dodge." "I am sorry," Pearl said. And she was, in the direct and specific way that she had learned sorrow worked, not as a grand emotion but as a quiet acknowledgement that something real had been lost. "It was 3 years ago," Orville said. "I am not still grieving in the way that prevents a person from moving forward. I want you to know that. What I said on the porch about a partnership, about something permanent, that was not desperation, it was thought." Pearl set down the shirt. She looked at him across the table. "What was your thinking exactly?" "Mrs. Pierce's letter said you had experience managing a household, which proved true," Orville said. "It said you were a widow, which suggested you had some knowledge of how a working ranch operates, at least the domestic side." It said you were a woman of strong character who had persisted through difficulty, which was her diplomatic way of saying that you had been through something that would have broken a weaker person. Roy Turner, Pearl said. The name cost her nothing anymore, which was its own kind of progress. I did not know the specifics, Orville said, only that there had been a difficulty. I have known Adelaide Pierce for 15 years, and when she uses the phrase strong character, she means something has been tested and held. Pearl was quiet for a moment, looking at the mended shirt in her hands, at the careful rows of stitching that was already more even than what had been there before. My husband was a gambler, she said. It was the first time she had said it in those exact terms, cleanly, without qualification. He lost everything we had and more. He died of a fever 14 months after we arrived in Caldwell, and I have been managing on my own since. I know something about managing on your own, Orville said. Yes, she said. I expect you do. There was a long silence that was not uncomfortable, which told Pearl something important. An uncomfortable silence meant that two people had nothing to say to each other or were afraid of what might be said. A comfortable one meant they had passed some threshold she could not have specified but could feel. 3 months, she said, returning to her mending. 3 months, he agreed and went back to his accounts. October came to the Norris ranch with cold nights and warm days, and the kind of hard, clear beauty that Pearl had been grudgingly coming to associate with Kansas, the land's compensation for its emotional severity. She had not expected to love the landscape here. She had arrived thinking of Kansas as the place her husband had taken her, temporary territory that had become a trap by accident, and she had spent 3 years looking at the horizon the way you look at a wall. But on the ranch there was something different about it, or perhaps she was different herself. The view from the kitchen garden in the morning, with the sky going from black to blue to blazing orange over the flat eastern horizon, was the kind of view that worked on you slowly. It was not dramatic like a mountain or intimate like a forest. It was honest in a way that she found, gradually, she needed. She and Orville fell into a working rhythm that was practical and efficient and slowly became something else as well, something she did not have a name for yet and was not in a hurry to find one. He came in from the fields at noon for the midday meal and they ate together and talked about the ranch, about what needed doing, about the accounts he was slowly pulling into better shape now that the household costs had come down under Pearl's management. In the evenings they sat in the parlor or on the porch and she read, or he played the fiddle with increasing competence, or they talked. The talking was what she had not expected. Orville Norris was not a verbose man. He did not fill silence with words when silence would do. But when he had something to say, he said it with a directness and an intelligence that Pearl found she had been starving for without having known it. Roy Turner had been charming and talkative, and had filled every room with conversation that turned out, on examination, to be mostly noise. Orville was the opposite. He said less, but what he said had density. He asked her opinions and meant the questions. He asked what she thought about the East Field, whether the crop rotation he was planning made sense given the soil conditions, and she told him about what she remembered watching her father do in Ohio, and he listened carefully and asked follow-up questions. He asked what she thought about the cattle, about which of the 40 head were worth keeping and which were costing more than they produced, and she walked the fields with him and listened and looked and offered what judgment she could. He did not condescend to her, and he did not praise her as if her competence was a surprise. He simply treated her thinking as worth considering, and the effect of that on Pearl was profound in ways she found it difficult to examine directly. They had their first argument in the second week of October over the question of the additional 2 hands Orville was considering hiring before the winter. "You cannot afford it yet," Pearl said. She had been looking at his accounts for the past 2 weeks, not because he had asked her to, but because she had found the ledger in the kitchen and opened it with the practical curiosity of someone who needed to understand the full shape of a thing in order to manage within it. The cattle sales from September were better, but not well enough to carry 2 extra wages through a winter with reduced work. "I need the help," Orville said, and there was an edge in his voice she had not heard before, a tightness that told her she had touched something sensitive. "One hand," Pearl said, not backing down but adjusting the angle. "One hand now, another in the spring when you have the revenue from the crop rotation to cover it. I can take on more of the outdoor work through winter, which is manageable when the garden is down. That closes the gap." Orville was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to catalog, the one where he was processing something he had not considered from that direction. "The outdoor work is not light," he said finally. "I do not want to add it to what you are already carrying." "What I am carrying now is a fraction of what needs to be done," Pearl said. "I have been limiting myself to the house and garden because that was how the arrangement was defined, but I am not incapable of other work, and you are short-handed, and there is no logical reason I should not help with what needs helping." He looked at her for another long moment. "You want to work cattle. I want to work whatever needs working," Pearl said. "I'm not here to hold to the letter of a job description when the job description does not fit the actual situation." It was the most she had said about her own investment in the ranch's success, and they both noticed it. The room was quiet for a moment. "One hand," Orville said. "One hand," Pearl agreed. The man Orville hired was named Samuel Greer, a 42-year-old former cowpuncher from Texas, who had bad knees from too many years on horseback, and had been looking for work that let him stay mostly on the ground. He arrived in late October with a bedroll, a battered trunk, and a disposition so steady and good-humored that Pearl liked him within 20 minutes of his arrival. He moved into the bunkhouse and settled into the work with the quiet competence of a man who had been doing this in various configurations for 20 years. Samuel Greer also, within the first week, began treating Pearl as if she were already the lady of the ranch, which was both slightly presumptuous and very perceptive of him. He called her Mrs. Turner and addressed Orville and Pearl together when he had questions about the work, as naturally as if the arrangement had been explained to him, which it had not been. "He thinks we are married," Pearl told Orville one evening, with something in her voice that she was careful to keep neutral. Orville was cleaning the lamp glass at the kitchen table. He did not look up. "What did you tell him?" "I did not correct him," Pearl said. "It seemed more complicated than necessary." Orville set down the lamp glass. Now he did look up. "Is that a problem?" Pearl considered. "Not a practical one," she said. "Pearl," Orville said, and then stopped. He picked up the lamp glass again, turned it in his hands, set it down again. "At the end of the 3 months, what are you thinking?" "I am thinking," Pearl said carefully, "that I have not been this content since before I came to Kansas." She paused. "I am thinking that this ranch has become, in a way that I did not expect and cannot entirely account for, something that feels like mine." Orville was very still. "I am also thinking," Pearl continued, because she had started and could not reasonably stop, "that I have been burned before by moving on feeling rather than evidence, and that I am constitutionally unable to do that again." "What evidence would you need?" Orville asked. His voice was very level. Pearl thought about that. It was, she realized, a very good question, because she had been so busy protecting herself from a repeat of Roy Turner that she had not actually thought about what the affirmative case looked like. What evidence of trustworthiness did she actually require? "Time," she said, "and honesty. And for both of us to have chosen this clearly without being driven to it by circumstances." "The circumstances drove you to my door," Orville pointed out. "That was how we met." "Yes," Pearl said, "but they do not drive me now. I am staying because I want to stay." Orville was quiet for so long that Pearl began to wonder if she had misread the entire situation, if the partnership he had described was only practical and she had invented the rest of it, if she was about to experience a version of the kind of humiliation she could not afford a second time. Then he said, "I have not wanted to say more than I meant. I have been very careful about that." "I know," Pearl said. "I want to say something now," he said, "that I mean entirely." He looked at her across the table, and what was in his expression was the same thing she had seen on the porch on the first day, that deliberate honesty that she had not known quite how to handle. "I have been watching you for 2 months. I have watched you work and think and argue with me and care about this place as if it were already yours. And I find that I am not interested in a housekeeper. I am not interested in a business partner. I am interested in you specifically, Pearl Turner, and I would very much like you to stay on whatever terms make that possible." Pearl Turner had been very good for a very long time at keeping things sealed. She had learned how to keep herself from wanting things that were not certain, from reaching for things that might be pulled away. The training had been comprehensive, and the lessons had been expensive. But sitting at that kitchen table in the lamplight with October wind pressing against the windows, and the fiddle leaning against the parlor wall and 14 jars of tomatoes she had put up herself lined along the pantry shelf, she found that the seal had been weakening for weeks and was now genuinely unsustainable. "I am interested in you as well," she said. "Specifically." It was not a declaration of love, because Pearl Turner was too honest for declarations she could not yet fully support. It was a statement of direction, which was considerably more binding. Orville smiled. Not the cautious near-smile she had collected over the previous weeks, but the full one, the transforming one, and Pearl allowed herself to feel it land. November came with the first real cold, a deep sky overnight frost that killed the last of the garden and turned the fields to pale gold and silver. Pearl woke early and stood on the porch with coffee and watched the sun come up over the frost-stiff grass, and felt the particular peace of a person who has, after a long detour through very difficult territory, arrived somewhere they recognize as right. The day that changed everything came at the beginning of November, on a Tuesday, which Pearl would always remember because Tuesdays had been the day Roy used to go to town and lose money, and she had always associated them with dread, and this Tuesday made her revise that association. A man arrived on horseback at noon, riding a horse that had been pushed too hard and whose flanks were heaving. The man was well dressed in the way that men who wanted to appear important rather than actually important were well dressed, all surface and no substance. He had a thin mustache and eyes that moved around the yard in the quick assessing way of someone who was calculating the value of things. His name was Franklin Carr, and he was, he announced, a land agent from Wichita. Pearl was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she heard the exchange between Orville and this man through the open window with the particular clarity that cold air and open windows provide. She did not move. She stood at the window and listened. Franklin Carr had come, it emerged, to make Orville an offer on the ranch. Someone back east, he said, a consortium of investors, was interested in Kansas grazing land and was prepared to pay a very fair price, a very generous price, more than the land was currently worth on the open market, for the right parcel in the right location. The Norris Ranch was, it turned out, exactly the right parcel in exactly the right location, because it sat at the junction of two natural watercourses that made it unusually valuable for large-scale grazing operations. "I am not selling," Orville said. Franklin Carr began explaining the financial advantages in more detail. He had papers. He had figures. He had the particular eloquence of a man who sold things for a living, and was very good at finding the place where a person's resistance was thinnest and applying pressure there. Pearl could hear the conversation going on, and she could hear Orville's responses, which were patient but consistent, and she was about to go back to what she was doing when Franklin Carr said something that changed the temperature of the room she was standing in. "I understand you have a woman working here," Carr said. "A widow." "Mrs. Turner." There was a pause. "What of it?" Orville said. "Only that a man alone might be reluctant to sell the place he has built," Carr said, with the smoothness of someone who had prepared this approach in advance. "But a man starting over, with a woman who might prefer a settled life in town to the isolation of a working ranch, that man might see the advantages differently." The implication was clear. Carr was suggesting that Pearl was an instability, a reason Orville might need to reconsidering, and the way he was suggesting it made Pearl's skin prickle with a cold that had nothing to do with the November air. "Mrs. Turner," Orville said, and his voice was absolutely even, "has more interest in this ranch's success than anyone currently standing in this yard. She is not a reason to sell. She is a reason not to." Silence. "She is a housekeeper," Carr said. "She is a partner," Orville said, "and I suggest you take your papers and your consortium back to Wichita." Pearl stood at the kitchen window for a long moment after the sound of Carr's horse leaving had faded down the road. Then she went to the cupboard, took out 2 cups and made coffee, and when Orville came through the kitchen door she put a cup in front of him without saying anything. He sat down. He drank the coffee. He looked at her. "You heard," he said. "I heard," she said. "Good," he said. "Then I do not have to repeat it." Pearl sat down across from him. She put her hands around her cup. She looked at the surface of the coffee and at the steam rising from it and at her own hands, which were not the hands she had had 3 years ago, not the soft Ohio hands of a woman who had not yet learned what hands were for, but working hands, capable hands, the hands of a woman who had built something. "He will come back," she said. "People like that always come back, and next time he may have more leverage." "What leverage?" Orville asked. "I do not know yet," Pearl said. "But men who sell things for consortiums do not accept one refusal as final." She was right. She knew she was right because she had spent 3 years in Caldwell watching the way money moved, and how the people who moved it operated, and Franklin Carr was the kind of smooth-talking agent who worked for men with a long view and the patience to apply pressure until the pressure became unbearable. She was right sooner than she expected. 3 days later, a letter arrived from the county seat, addressed to Orville, from a lawyer Pearl had never heard of. The letter informed Orville that there was a question regarding the original deed of the Norris Ranch, specifically regarding a mineral rights claim filed in 1878 by a man named William Hooper, and that if Orville could not demonstrate clear title including mineral rights, there was the possibility that the land itself might be subject to legal challenge. Pearl read the letter over Orville's shoulder. She could feel his stillness, the particular quality of a man trying to determine the shape of something threatening. "Is there a deed?" Pearl asked. "My father's deed," Orville said. "In the strong box. I have never had cause to question it." They looked at the deed. It was clear and properly executed, filed in 1874 when Orville's father had purchased the land from the Territorial Land Office. There was no mention of William Hooper. There was no prior mineral rights claim on the record Orville had. "They invented this," Pearl said quietly. Orville looked at her. "Can they do that?" "Men with money can do a great many things," Pearl said, "but they can also be countered if you know how." She paused. "There is a lawyer in Caldwell named Henry Marsh. He is a good lawyer, and he owes Mrs. Pierce a favor from several years back, which Mrs. Pierce has mentioned more than once. I think it is time to call on that favor." The following morning Pearl rode into Caldwell on the mare Orville kept for light work and presented herself at the office of Henry Marsh, Esq. Henry Marsh was a small, neat man in his 50s who listened to the situation with the concentrated attention of a man used to finding the exact weight of things. "The deed is clear," he said when she had finished. "What they are doing is filing a nuisance claim with the county clerk in hopes that the threat of legal fees will pressure Mr. Norris into selling at their price. It is not an uncommon tactic." "Can we counter it?" Pearl asked. "Yes," Marsh said, "if Mr. Norris files a formal affirmation of clear title with supporting documentation within 30 days, the nuisance claim collapses. I can prepare the documentation. The filing fee is $12. Pearl had $14 in her own savings, which was everything she had been keeping against the future. She took 12 of it out of her coat pocket and put it on Henry Marsh's desk. Henry Marsh looked at the money. "Mrs. Pierce said you were a woman of strong character," he said. "See to the filing," Pearl said. When she came back to the ranch and told Orville what she had done and how, he was quiet for a moment in the particular way she had come to recognize as him processing something he had not expected. "That was your savings," he said. "It was an investment," Pearl said. Pearl, he said. We can discuss the details later, Pearl said. Right now there is still the afternoon work and Samuel cannot manage the fence line repair on his own. She had started for the door when his hand came around her wrist gently, with the careful quality of a man who was very aware of what he was doing. She stopped. She turned. He was standing close, closer than the working distance they had maintained, and his expression was entirely unguarded in a way she had only glimpsed before in small moments, and what was in it was something she did not need to translate. "I want to ask you something," Orville said, "not as an employer or a business partner or as any category that can be reduced to practical terms." "Ask," Pearl said. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not at the end of 3 months as a reassessment of the partnership arrangement. Not as a solution to the land question or the consortium or any other practical problem. "I am asking because I love you, and because I want you here not as an employee or a partner in the business sense, but as my wife, in all the ways that means. I am asking because I have not felt about anyone what I feel about you, and because this ranch is not a home without you in it, and I know that because it was not a home before you came." The word love was the one she had been afraid of. Not because she doubted it, but because she could feel, in the interior of herself, exactly how completely she meant her own answer. And that kind of completeness was terrifying after the experience of having invested everything in something hollow. But she looked at his face, at this man who had offered her an exit before he made his proposal, who had called her a partner when a land agent tried to diminish her, who had listened to her about the accounts and the crops and the fence line with the full attention of someone who believed her thinking was worth considering, and who was now asking her not with calculation or desperation, but with the clear and steady honesty she had come to understand, was simply who he was. "Yes," Pearl said. "I will marry you." He brought her hand up, both his hands around hers, and held it for a moment without speaking, and the quality of the silence was unlike any silence Pearl had experienced before, warm and full and without edges. Then she laughed, which was not a response she had anticipated but which came from somewhere real, from the relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, carefully, set it down. He laughed too, which she had not heard before, a real laugh surprised out of him, and it was a good sound. They were married on December 8, 1883, at the Caldwell Methodist Church, by the Reverend Thomas Aldridge, with Mrs. Adelaide Pierce in the front pew and Samuel Greer standing next to Orville as his witness, and 3 women from the Ladies' Aid Society in attendance. Pearl wore the best dress she owned, which was not the blue one but a dark green wool dress she had made herself in November from fabric she had bought carefully with what remained after the lawyer's fee. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had collected from the ranch in September, and pressed between the pages of one of Orville's books because she had, even then, somehow known she might want them. Henry Marsh had filed the documentation, and the nuisance claim had been withdrawn inside 2 weeks. Franklin Carr had not appeared again at the ranch, and Pearl suspected he would not, because men who operated that way moved on to softer targets when a target proved resistant. The wedding was simple and direct, and said exactly what Pearl needed it to say, which was that 2 people who had both been damaged by loss and bad circumstance had looked at each other clearly, without illusion, and chosen. They rode back to the ranch in the buckboard in the late afternoon, with the winter sky going gold and purple over the flat horizon. Samuel Greer had gone ahead to see to the evening work, giving them the ride alone, with the tact of a man who understood occasions. Orville drove. Pearl sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched and the prairie went by in the early winter silence, the dry grass and the bare branches and the big empty sky that she had learned to need. "Are you happy?" Orville asked. Pearl considered this with the honesty she applied to everything. "Yes," she said. "I am." She paused. "It is a strange feeling." "Strange how?" "I am not sure I have been simply, plainly happy before," she said. "There have been good moments, good days. but happy as a condition, as a state of being. That is new. Orville was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. For me also, he said. She put her hand through the crook of his arm and leaned slightly into his shoulder, and he did not say anything, just adjusted his arm to accommodate her and drove the horses home. The first winter of their marriage was the hardest season Pearl had ever lived through, and also the best, which was a combination she had not thought possible until she experienced it. Kansas in January was brutal, a cold that had nothing gentle in it, that came off the plains with a directness that felt personal, and there were 3 blizzards that kept them housebound for days at a time and required careful management of both the livestock and the fuel supply. But housebound with Orville was a condition Pearl found she could sustain indefinitely. They read. They talked in the long evenings when the wind made the windows rattle and the lamplight made the kitchen into a kind of island. He taught her to play checkers, which she beat him at within 2 weeks, and she taught him the card game her mother had played in Ohio, which he took to with an enthusiasm she found endearing. He played the fiddle more confidently now, working through pieces she recognized and some she did not, and in the 3rd week of January she discovered, unexpectedly and without any prior indication, that she knew how to dance. It happened because he was playing a reel, a quick-stepping thing that her body apparently remembered from some childhood gathering she had half forgotten, and before she had consciously decided to do it, she was moving in the middle of the kitchen floor, and the look on Orville's face when he registered what was happening made her laugh so hard she had to stop. He set down the fiddle and they danced together in the kitchen, while the blizzard pressed against the house, and Pearl felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 3 years, something she had not even fully registered as a weight until it lifted. February brought the question of the spring planting, which they planned together over the kitchen table with the accounts and the seed catalog and the soil maps Orville had made himself, careful drawings of the fields with notes on drainage and sun exposure and past yields. Pearl had never done anything quite like this before, and she found it consumed her. The puzzle of it, the way each decision connected to the next and the one after, the way a good plan in February could mean the difference between a comfortable autumn and a difficult one. By the time the seed orders were placed and the rotation was settled, and the anticipated revenue was calculated against the current costs, Pearl could see clearly that if the spring went well, by the fall they would be able to hire a second hand, and by the spring of 1885 they would be in a position to break the 12 acres of land on the west side that had been sitting fallow since Orville's father's time. 60 acres under cultivation by 1885, Orville said, looking at the numbers. With 2 good seasons and no disasters, Pearl said, but 60 acres is achievable. And the cattle, if we bring the herd to 60 head by fall. 60 head and 60 acres, Pearl said. That is a different kind of ranch. Orville looked at her across the table, and there was in his expression the particular combination of tenderness and respect that she had come to understand was how he looked at her when she had said something that matched exactly what he was thinking. "This is what I needed," he said simply. "This. Someone to build with." Pearl reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not because it was a dramatic moment, but because it was a real one, and she had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that real moments were the ones worth inhabiting fully. In March, Pearl discovered she was expecting a child. She knew before she said anything to Orville, carrying the knowledge for a week in the private interior space where she processed things, turning it carefully, examining it for the shape of how she felt about it. What she found was not the fear she might have expected, not the echo of Clara Norris's death and the baby that had not survived, but something else, something more complicated and ultimately more hopeful. She told him on a Thursday evening, after supper, sitting on the porch in the early March cold with coats on, and the first green beginning to push up in the garden beds. Orville was very still for a moment after she told him. Then he turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright in the particular way she had only seen once before, when he had said "I love you" and meant it with everything he had. "Are you well?" he asked. "You are well." "I am very well," Pearl said. "I feel fine. I feel good, actually." He reached out and put his hand against her face, a gesture so careful and full of feeling that Pearl had to look away for a moment and then back. "Pearl," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you frightened?" He asked because he was always honest about the hard things, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. "A little," she said, "but more glad than frightened." He moved his chair closer to hers, close enough that their arms were touching, and they sat that way on the porch in the March cold, while the light went out of the sky and the first stars came through, and Pearl leaned her head against his shoulder and breathed the night air and let herself be simply, plainly happy. Spring arrived with the force that Kansas spring always had, a rush of energy that turned the land from brown to green in what seemed like a single week, and the Norris ranch came alive in a way that felt personal to Pearl, as if the land itself were responding to something that had changed in the people running it. Samuel Greer returned from the winter he had spent with his daughter's family in Emporia, and they hired a second hand, a young man named James who was 19, strong and eager, and who turned out to have a real gift with cattle that made him worth considerably more than the wages they were paying him. The crop rotation Pearl and Orville had planned over the February kitchen table went into the ground in April, the new fields breaking cleanly under the plow, the soil dark and deep in a way that promised well. Orville was out at first light every morning, and Pearl was in the garden through mid-morning, and then managing the house and the accounts and the correspondence in the afternoons, her energy surprising her, the work sustaining her in a way that the uncertainty of the past years never had. She and Orville worked well together with the ease of two people who had never had to learn to collaborate, because collaboration had been their mode from the beginning. They argued sometimes, specifically and practically, about things that mattered, and resolved the arguments with the mutual respect of people who had agreed from the start that both of them were going to be right sometimes and wrong sometimes, and that honesty was more important than the comfort of always yielding. In June, there was a second visit from Franklin Carr, which Pearl had been half expecting. He arrived looking slightly less polished than the previous time, as if the winter and the failed nuisance claim had taken some of the surface gloss off, and he sat on the porch and made another offer, larger than the first, with the smooth insistence of a man who had been told to secure the property and intended to do it. Pearl sat beside Orville for this conversation, which was a deliberate choice, and which Carr registered with visible and not entirely hidden displeasure. "The offer is significantly better than last time," Carr said. "Yes," Orville said, "and the answer is significantly more final than last time." Carr looked at Pearl. "Mrs. Norris, surely you have thoughts on the advantages of a settled life in town compared to the isolation of this kind of operation." Pearl smiled at him with the particular warmth of a woman who has been underestimated before and no longer finds it upsetting. "I grew this ranch with my own hands," she said pleasantly. "I have 14 jars of tomatoes in that pantry from my own garden, a crop rotation that will net us significantly better than last year, and a vegetable patch that I planted from seed and intend to eat from for the rest of my life. I am not interested in selling, Mr. Carr, and neither is my husband." Carr left without further argument. Orville watched him ride down the road and then looked at Pearl with an expression that was several things at once: admiration and love and a kind of contained joy. "The rest of your life," he said. "The rest of my life," Pearl confirmed. Their son was born on November 4, 1884, with the assistance of Mrs. Carolyn Delaney, the midwife in Caldwell, who arrived at the ranch the previous afternoon and stayed through the long night with the calm competence that Pearl found she needed more than anything else. Orville stayed in the kitchen through the night, and Pearl could hear him moving, making coffee, going to the door to check the weather and coming back, the particular restless quality of a man who was afraid and had nothing useful to do with it. The birth was long and hard, and Pearl was not afraid, or not afraid in the way she had expected. She was focused in a way that went beyond ordinary thought, consumed entirely by the fact of what was happening, and when it was over and the baby was placed in her arms, she understood something she had not had words for before, about why you kept going through difficult things, about what waiting on the other side of effort was. She named the boy Henry, after Henry Marsh, who had filed the affirmation of clear title and defended the ranch that was now the boy's inheritance. Orville agreed to this with the immediate conviction of a man who recognized a right answer. Henry Norris was born into a home that was a real one, built not on one person's ambition or another person's sacrifice, but on two people's deliberate choice to work toward something together. He had a father who read him Tennyson before he could understand the words, and who played the fiddle on Sunday evenings in the parlor while the fire burned. He had a mother who knew the name of every plant in the garden and every cow in the herd, and who kept the accounts with a precision that would eventually produce more than the original plan had projected. He had, in Samuel Greer, a kind of honorary grandfather who taught him the names of the stars visible from the Kansas sky on clear winter nights, and told him stories about Texas that were only half true and all of them entertaining. Pearl recovered from the birth with the thoroughness of a woman who was healthy and well-fed and well cared for, which she had not always been, and which she did not take for granted. By the following spring she was back to the full rhythm of the ranch work, carrying Henry in a fabric sling across her chest when he was small enough and transitioning to leaving him with Samuel Greer's patient supervision when he was old enough to be interested in the world outside the house. 1885 was the year they broke the West Fields. It was also the year they brought the cattle herd to 62 head, 2 more than projected, because of a particularly good early summer and a partnership they formed with a neighboring ranch owned by a family named Sorensen, trading grazing rights for shared use of equipment that neither ranch could justify owning alone. The Sorensen arrangement was Pearl's idea, proposed to Britta Sorensen over coffee at the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, where Pearl had become a member the previous autumn, and where she had discovered that her own situation 3 years earlier had not been unique, that there were women in Caldwell and the surrounding territory who needed exactly what she had needed then: honest information and practical help without the overhead of condescension. She started a small lending operation from the Ladies' Aid of practical resources, books on homesteading and household management, seed catalogs, copies of the county land regulations. The kind of information that made a real difference to someone trying to build something on their own. It was a small thing, but it was hers, and she was proud of it. In the spring of 1886, James, the hired hand, left to start his own operation on land he had saved enough to buy, and Orville hired 2 new men to replace him and to manage the expanded fields, because 60 acres was now under cultivation, and the operation had grown to the point where the original 2-man crew was genuinely insufficient. Pearl oversaw the hiring with Orville, interviewing the candidates with the practicality of someone who had learned to read people and who had specific criteria that went beyond simple competence. They hired a man named Thomas Bright and a man named Peter Calloway, both experienced and steady, and with the 4 of them the ranch ran with a smoothness that gave Pearl and Orville something they had not entirely had before, which was time. Not much of it, because a working ranch in 1886 Kansas did not produce surplus time as a regular commodity, but enough. Enough to take Sunday afternoons and sit on the porch together while Henry played in the yard, and the summer heat made everything slow and golden. Enough to ride out to the far edge of the property sometimes in the early morning and watch the sun come up over the flat horizon and talk about what was next. What was next was the question Pearl loved most. Not because the present was insufficient, but because she had discovered that she was someone who needed to be building towards something, who found the process of imagining and planning and executing as sustaining as the results. Orville was the same, which was one of the deep compatibilities they had discovered in themselves, this shared need to be working toward a horizon that kept moving as you approached it. They talked about the house. It was solid but small, and with Henry growing and the possibility of more children, the 2 bedrooms were going to be tight. They talked about adding a room on the east side, a proper sitting room separate from the parlor, with windows on 3 sides and space for books and the fiddle, and the things that made a house into a home beyond mere function. They talked about the town. Caldwell was growing, and growth brought complications and opportunities in equal measure. A new school had opened in 1885, which became relevant to them very directly and pleasantly when Pearl discovered, in the fall of 1886, that she was expecting a second child. The second baby arrived in May of 1887, a girl this time, small and dark-haired and possessed of a particular willfulness that was evident within the first week of her life, and which both her parents recognized with the rueful delight of people seeing something familiar. They named her Louise after Pearl's mother, and Henry took to her with the earnest attentiveness of a boy who has been the center of attention, and is genuinely, if sometimes exhaustingly, willing to share it. The addition to the house was built that summer, with Orville and Thomas and Peter doing most of the framing and Pearl making the decisions about how the interior was arranged, which windows went where, and how the light moved through in the morning and the afternoon. It was the room she had imagined in February of 1884, looking at the plans over the kitchen table, and it came out very close to what she had imagined, which was the satisfaction particular to the realization of something you have been patient about for a long time. They painted the barn that fall. It was not a grand event, not the thing that stories were built around, but Pearl stood back and looked at it afterward with the red fresh against the blue October sky and felt the completeness of it, the way the ranch looked now like a place that was tended and intended, that reflected back the effort of the people who worked it. Samuel Greer retired in the spring of 1888, his knees finally making the decision he had been putting off for 2 years. He moved into town to live with his daughter's family, and the parting was the kind that left something real behind. Henry cried and Samuel told him, with the gravity of a man delivering important information to a very small person, that crying was acceptable for one day, and after that you remembered the good things, and that was enough. They hired Samuel's replacement carefully, a man named Joseph Cole who was young and quiet and excellent with horses, and the ranch continued its expansion with the steady organic quality of something growing, because the conditions were right for it. Pearl thought sometimes about the woman who had walked up the road to this ranch in September of 1883 with 17 cents in her coat pocket, and a letter in her hand and a broken boot heel, and the carefully constructed armor of a person who had been badly hurt, and intended to prevent a repeat. That woman had been brave in the way that necessity produces, which is real but narrow and exhausting, and cannot be sustained indefinitely. She had been careful in a way that bordered on closed. What had opened her was not dramatic in the way that the stories about such things usually were. It had been slow and particular, and had required her to pay attention, which was the thing she was actually best at, the thing that had always been more use to her than anything else. Paying attention to a man who offered exits and meant them, paying attention to overripe tomatoes and a broken chair rung, paying attention to a grave in the corner of a garden and what it told you about loss and persistence. Paying attention to the way a person who was trying to build something alone looked at 2 months of partnership and said, with the full weight of something earned, "This is what I needed." Orville caught her one evening standing in the garden in the late 1888 summer, looking at nothing in particular, which he had learned was a state she sometimes needed. "Thinking?" he asked. "Counting," Pearl said. "What are you counting?" She turned to look at him. This man who was 35 now and whose dark hair had a thread of silver at the temples, and whose hands were even rougher from more years of work, and whose eyes were still the color of creek water on a cloudy day, which she had thought about on the first morning and had never entirely stopped thinking about. "Good things," Pearl said. He came and stood beside her in the garden, looking out over the fields in the late light, the gold of it and the long shadows. Henry was at the far edge of the yard throwing a ball against the barn wall in the focused, repetitive way of small boys who are practicing something. Louise was asleep in the house, her small, determined face smooth in the evening quiet. "Pearl," Orville said. "Yes." She turned to him. He put his arm around her shoulders, unhurried and easy, the way a man touches a person he has touched 1,000 times before and means to touch 1,000 times more. "Are you still glad?" he asked. "Still happy? Because I think about that. I think about the fact that you walked up that road not for us, not for any of this, but because you needed work and this was the nearest available option." Pearl leaned into him. She looked at the fields, her fields as much as his, the 68 acres now under cultivation, the barn with its fresh red paint, the vegetable garden with its staked tomatoes and its patient rows. She looked at the addition on the east side of the house with its 3 windows, where she could see the lamp burning in the sitting room where the books were. "I walked up that road," Pearl said, "and you said you had a better offer." She paused. "You were right." He pulled her closer. She could hear his laugh, low and warm, against the top of her head, and the evening settled around them with the particular piece of a place that had been worked and loved into becoming what it was. The years that followed brought more good things and some hard ones, because that was the texture of life in Kansas in the latter years of the 19th century, and the Norris Ranch was not exempt from the weather or the market or the thousand small and large difficulties that working land produced. There was a drought year in 1889 that was lean and required careful management, and the drawing down of reserves that Pearl guarded like a physical thing. There was a fence dispute with a new neighbor to the north, a difficult and litigious man named Hogarth, that went to the county court and was resolved in the Norrises' favor largely because Pearl had kept meticulous records of the original boundary surveys and could produce documentation that Hogarth could not contradict. There was the summer Henry was 9 and fell from the top fence rail and broke his arm, and the 2 terrible hours before Mrs. Delaney arrived, and Orville's face during those 2 hours, which Pearl kept in the part of her memory that she returned to when she needed to know the full depth of what they were to each other. The arm healed straight, and Henry bore the experience with a stoicism that alarmed Pearl until she realized it was genuine, that her son was simply one of those people who moved through physical difficulty without much drama, which she hoped was useful and suspected might also cause problems down the road. Louise, on the other hand, brought drama in abundance, the expressive kind, the kind that filled rooms with opinions and feelings and a persistent questioning of why things were arranged the way they were arranged and whether they needed to be. Pearl recognized this quality with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce pride, and understood that her daughter was going to be someone who made people reckon with her, which was inconvenient and necessary in equal measure. In the fall of 1890, the Kansas drought finally broke with 3 weeks of steady autumn rain, and the relief was physical, felt in the fields and the faces of everyone who worked them. That winter was the warmest in Pearl's Kansas memory, and she and Orville spent more evenings than usual in the sitting room she had planned in a cold February kitchen 7 years before, the fire burning and the books open, and Louise asleep on the floor on a blanket because she refused to go to bed when there was still company and conversation available, and Henry reading with the serious focus he brought to everything. Pearl looked across the room at Orville, who was reading but had looked up at the same moment she had, and they looked at each other across the room over their children's heads with the particular communication of people who have learned each other so thoroughly that whole conversations happen in the space of a glance. What the glance said was, "This is it." This is the thing. This is what was built. There was one more piece of the story that Pearl liked to tell in later years, when she was asked about how things had started, which people occasionally asked because the story had gotten around, the way stories do in small communities, the version with the interesting shape that made people curious about the original. What people wanted to know, usually, was what she had felt when he had said those words on the porch. "I have a better offer." Standing there with her cracked boot heel and her 17 cents and her carefully maintained armor, what had she felt? Pearl always thought about this honestly before answering. "I felt like it might be a trap," she said. "Because I had learned by then that things that sound like opportunity often are, and I felt like I should be careful, which I was." "But," they asked, because there was always a but, and she let them hear it. "But I also felt," Pearl said, "that he had noticed my boot heel without making me feel ashamed of it, and that seemed important." In 1892, the spring that Henry turned 8 and Louise turned 5, the Norris Ranch expanded again, this time to include the parcel to the south that had come available when its previous owner, an older man named Guthrie, had decided to go live with family in Missouri. The parcel added 30 acres of solid grazing land and a secondary water source that strengthened the ranch's position in a dry year in ways Pearl had calculated, and Orville had agreed were worth the investment. To purchase the Guthrie parcel, they used their own savings, which they had built carefully and with forethought over 9 years, and the decision was made at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, with the accounts spread out, and the crop projections and the livestock numbers, and all the information Pearl kept with the meticulous precision she brought to everything that mattered. After the signing, Pearl added the parcel to the map of the ranch that she kept updated in the ledger, and looked at the full shape of it, nearly 100 acres now, and thought about a woman walking up a road in September 1883 with 17 cents and a letter, and the careful armor of someone who had been through enough to know that hope was expensive. That woman had been right to be careful. She had been right to ask for 3 months and a fair wage and an exit if things went wrong. She had been right to pay attention and to refuse to move faster than the evidence supported and to insist on honesty at every step. What she had not calculated, because you could not calculate it because it was not in any ledger, was the specific quality of Orville Norris on a porch step, turning his hat brim with both hands, being completely honest about what he had and what he needed and what he hoped for, without calculation or performance, simply because that was who he was. You could not calculate for that, but you could, when you had been lucky enough to find it, choose it. And Pearl Turner Norris, widow, housekeeper, partner, wife, mother, rancher, and member of the Caldwell Ladies' Aid Society, had chosen it with everything she had, deliberately and clearly, on a September morning in 1883, with the dust of a 4-mile walk on her boots and the last of her courage still intact. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, December 8, 1893, Orville built a fire in the sitting room and played the fiddle while the children slept, playing through the reel that had made Pearl dance in the kitchen in January 1884, the one that her body had remembered before her mind could interfere. And Pearl danced again, in the sitting room she had planned in a February kitchen, with the winter pressing against the glass. And Orville set down the fiddle halfway through and danced with her, the two of them moving together in the warm light from the fire with 10 years of the ranch, and the work, and the love, and the children, and the fields, and the mornings watching the sun come up. Over the Kansas horizon behind them and everything else still ahead. The stars were out over the ranch when they stepped onto the porch later, the winter sky clear and absolutely crowded with light in the way that Kansas winter sky could be, that particular overwhelming abundance that Pearl had eventually made peace with and then come to love. Henry would grow up to run the ranch alongside his father and eventually take it on himself, bringing his own wife to the house Pearl had shaped, and his sister Louise would go to the new teachers' college in Emporia and come back to Caldwell to teach, which surprised no one who had known her as a child. The ranch would outlast the drought of the 1890s and the difficulties that came with the turning of the century, because it had been built by people who planned for difficulty, and because its roots were in solid ground. But on that December evening in 1893, standing on the porch with Orville's arm around her, and the cold, clean air of a Kansas winter on her face, and the light from the sitting room windows falling in warm rectangles on the yard she had walked up 9 years ago with nothing but her own stubborn, capable self, Pearl did not think about any of that future. She thought about the stars, and the cold, and the warmth at her side, and the sound of children breathing in their rooms. She thought about an offer made on a porch step and a woman who had been brave enough, despite everything she had learned about the cost of hope, to hear it out. And she thought, as she had thought 10 years before and would think again in every year that followed, that it was the right choice, that it had always been the right choice, that some choices, made clearly and with open eyes in the full knowledge of what they might cost, turned out to be the ones that gave you everything. The prairie wind came up, soft and cold, and Pearl Turner Norris leaned into her husband's side and looked out at the dark land she knew and loved, every acre of it and breathed.